Men were not meant to be kidnapped off the street by the state and forced into the meat grinder of a losing war. And as such, we never developed sufficient defense mechanisms to prevent our leaders from slaughtering us by the hundreds of thousands. And we certainly have not evolved a natural instinct to rise up and prevent our government from forcing another government to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of its men for nothing. That's what has been happening in Ukraine for the last 3.5 years. Hundreds of thousands of men have been kidnapped off the street, have been forced to the front lines, and have been killed or maimed for less than nothing. Now, why do I say less than nothing? Well, in April of 2022, less than 2 months into the full scale war, Zelensky and Putin reached a tentative agreement. As reported in Foreign Affairs by Fiona Hill, a neocon, Russia had agreed to retreat to the pre-invasion line of control between Ukraine and the Russian separatists. And in exchange, Zelensky had agreed not to seek NATO membership and instead to receive security guarantees from a number of countries. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson personally flew to Kyiv, where he relayed to Zelensky the message that Putin was a war criminal who should be pressured and not negotiated with, and that the West was not ready for an end of the war, even if Ukraine was. It would not participate in any security guarantees. Weeks later, Joe Biden dispatched Lloyd Austin to Kyiv and let slip that the true purpose of the war for the West was never to preserve Ukrainian territory, but was always to weaken Russia, or as Lindsey Graham likes to put it, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian.
4 months into this thing, I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
Even if the war were miraculously ended at the current line of military control today. And it won't be. Russia is gaining land by the day and has no reason to agree to terms that preserve the current line of control. But even if it were miraculously ended at the current line of military control, that would have meant that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men died and were maimed only for Ukraine to retain less territory than it would have if the war had been ended under that tentative agreement. That's what I mean when I say that the Ukrainian men have died for less than nothing. Presumably, to the extent that they were willing to be there, Ukrainian men thought that they were fighting to preserve their territory, or maybe to keep their homes from being conquered, or otherwise to benefit their country. But they weren't. Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Lloyd Austin, and every other powerful figure in the West knew that there was at best a tiny chance that Ukraine would ever end the war with as much territory as was offered in that tentative agreement, let alone more. And so you might expect the leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, to be irate that the West forced him to fight this losing war and be eager to strike a permanent peace deal to prevent his people from continuing to die for less than nothing. But Zelensky wants to extend the losing war for longer. Why? After all, he's the one who negotiated the tentative agreement. So why is he the one that wants to extend the losing war for longer? Well, it's called gambling for resurrection. Everyone who has invested their political reputation into the war since the tentative agreement was sabotaged will be exposed if the war ends. In Europe, they'll just have to answer why they spent their country's treasure and kneecapped their economies and let the Nord Stream pipeline be blown up in the name of weakening Russia, only for Ukraine to come away with less territory and more men blown apart than would have been 2 months into the war. But in Ukraine, it will be far worse. Zelensky has to explain why he buckled to Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and forced hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men to die and be maimed for life for less than nothing. It's politically unsurvivable. It may well be personally unsurvivable. We should not forget that the man who negotiated the armistice that ended World War I, Matthias Erzberger, was shot less than 2 years after the war ended. That assassin was let off with a few months in prison, and the next one succeeded. Zelensky may well face the choice of either living in exile as a disgrace or risking assassination by Azov or other right wing neo Nazi militias that will blame him for their loss. It's a story we've seen before after a nation's humiliating defeat in a war that should have never been fought. The only way for Zelensky to avert that fate is to continue the war. As long as the war continues, he can remain as president. And perhaps he can eventually succeed in drawing either Europe or America into the war directly. Perhaps that new world war can then be won without going nuclear. Perhaps some new Prigozhin figure will appear and lead a magical coup in Russia. Even if it's an infinitesimally small chance that risks nuclear Armageddon, it's worth it to Zelensky to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men to preserve a small chance to escape humiliation and resurrect his reputation. After all, what is the difference between getting 500,000 men maimed and killed for less than nothing, or getting a million people killed and maimed for less than nothing? One death is a tragedy, but 500,000 or a million are both just statistics. Either way, Zelensky will likely be seen as a man whose cowardice destroyed Ukraine. Why not take the higher death statistic with a small chance of redeeming his legacy? That said, I didn't make this video today because I think that Zelensky's motives can be changed by calling them out in a YouTube video. His incentives are locked in. Trying to move Zelensky is as absurd as saying that we could move Netanyahu off of his genocidal plans for Gaza with a YouTube video. Those plans are what is keeping him out of jail. I made this video to warn you that Trump could soon be in exactly the same position as the Europeans. For now, he can say this isn't his war. That means he can settle it without admitting that he personally made a catastrophic decision in declining the earlier tentative agreement, because he wasn't in office for the earlier tentative agreement. But that won't be true if he turns down this deal, Putin. The second Russian troops take more territory than whatever they offer to Trump, and they likely will continue to take more and more territory without a peace deal. The second they have taken more territory than whatever they offer to Trump, he will be unable to justify having turned down the deal. And so Trump, like Biden and Johnson and Zelensky and most of Europe's leaders before him, will be incentivized to gamble for resurrection and continue prolonging the conflict for years, not giving a damn about the men that they are killing or the Ukrainian territory they are losing, but only about delaying the true ramifications of their decisions from coming out and preserving the tiny chance of a miraculous redemption of their legacies. So, especially if you were a Trump voter, and I was not, or if you care about Trump's legacy, or if you care about the Ukrainian and Russian men dying and being maimed in Ukraine, if you see them as human beings and not as statistics, I encourage you to call the White House and demand peace now. I'll leave you with the words of the late, great Alaskan Senator Mike Gravel. Do you know what's worse than a soldier dying in vain? It's more soldiers dying in vain. That's what's worse.